The morning sun glinted off the polished canopy of Lieutenant Hans Joachim Marseille's Messerschmitt Bf 109 F-4 as he leveled out at 6,000 meters over the endless, sun-bleached desert of North Africa. The date was June 3, 1942, and the air was so clear he could see the shimmering heat haze rising from the sand 20 kilometers away. At 22 years old, with 75 confirmed kills painted in neat rows on his fighter's tail, Marseille was the undisputed star of Jagdgeschwader 27, the Afrika wing. He was the star of Afrika, a marksman of such uncanny instinctive skill that even the hardened veterans of the Luftwaffe shook their heads in disbelief. He adjusted his silk scarf, a flamboyant touch in the drab cockpit, and let his eyes scan the vast, empty blue. He was hunting. Through his headset crackled the voice of his wingman Feldwebel Rainer Pertgen. Herr Lieutenant, nothing on the horizon. The Tommies must be sleeping late today. Marseille smiled, a confident, easy expression. Patience, Rainer. They will come. They always do. His fingers drummed lightly on the throttle of his Daimler-Benz DB601 engine. He was not just confident, he was supremely, artistically arrogant in his domain. The British Hawker Hurricanes and Curtiss P-40 Tomahawks he dueled daily were capable machines, flown by brave men, but they were predictable. He knew their limits, their tactics, their weaknesses. In his agile, lightweight 109, he felt like a falcon among pigeons. He could outclimb them, outturn them at most altitudes, and his 20 cannon and twin machine guns had ended the careers of dozens of their pilots. The desert sky was his personal canvas, and dogfighting was his art form. What Marseille, and indeed the entire Luftwaffe High Command in Berlin, could not possibly conceive on that brilliant morning was that their entire paradigm of aerial combat, a paradigm built on the cult of the individual ace, on qualitative superiority of machinery, on tactical genius, was already obsolete. It was being rendered irrelevant not in the skies over Europe, but on drafting tables in Long Island and in vast, anonymous factories in the American Midwest. The seeds of their future shock were being sown by men they would never meet, designing a weapon system they would have dismissed as a clumsy, inelegant impossibility. The war in Europe was still seen through a lens of 1940, where the Spitfire and the Bf 109 were the pinnacle. But in a hangar in Bethpage, New York, a different kind of aircraft was taking shape, one that embodied a brutal, new American philosophy of war, overwhelming, industrialized force, and the first terrifying whispers of its existence, reports that would be laughed out of intelligence briefings in Berlin, were already filtering back from the other side of the world, from a place called New Guinea. For now, Marseille's world was one of clear-cut superiority. The evidence was in his kill tally, in the daily reports flowing to Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring's desk. Throughout 1941 and into 1942, the Luftwaffe had maintained a staggering kill-to-loss ratio against Western Allied air forces. Over France and the English Channel, experienced German pilots flying the latest Bf 109F routinely achieved ratios of 3:1 or better against Spitfire Vs. In North Africa, against often outnumbered and logistically strained Commonwealth squadrons, the advantage felt even more pronounced. German pilots were battle-hardened from years of combat over Poland, France, and Russia. They saw their American counterparts, who were just beginning to trickle into the war, as enthusiastic amateurs. A captured Allied intelligence report, circulated among German fighter group commanders for amusement, quoted a young USAAF pilot describing his first combat. It was just like the movies, until the tracers started coming at me. The anecdote was met with derisive laughter in German officers' messes. These were not the steely-eyed knights of the air they were accustomed to fighting. This confidence was rooted in more than just battlefield success. It was baked into German military intelligence assessments. The WWII, Germany's intelligence service, produced detailed monthly reports on Allied war production. Their estimates for American fighter output in early 1942 were precise, authoritative, and catastrophically wrong. They reported that the United States, hampered by a peacetime economy and a lack of skilled labor, could produce perhaps 500 modern fighter aircraft per month across all types. The reality, unknown to them, was that American factories were already spooling up to a rhythm that defied European comprehension. At a single plant, Republic Aviation's sprawling complex in Farmingdale, New York, workers were preparing to build not 500 fighters a year, but nearly that many every month of a single new type. But the WWII's figures were accepted as gospel in Berlin. Why wouldn't they be? They fit the established narrative. America was a land of plenty but lacked the discipline, the technical sophistication, and the warrior spirit of the German Volk. Their machines would be crude, their pilots soft. This cultural and technical arrogance was mirrored perfectly in the Imperial Japanese Navy. Japanese naval aviators, the elite of the elite, had swept all before them from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean. Flying the Mitsubishi A6000, they believed they possessed the finest carrier-based fighter in the world. A belief that was, in early 1942, objectively true. The Zero's phenomenal range, its supernatural maneuverability, and the skill of its pilots had created an aura of invincibility. American pilots flying the clumsy Brewster Buffalo or the early model Wildcat were systematically butchered. Japanese intelligence assessments, based on pre-war analysis and the early battles, concluded that American aircraft design was conservative, even backward. They fixated on armor and heavy construction, which Japanese engineers dismissed as unnecessary weight that hampered performance. The American pilot, in the Japanese view, was physically larger but less agile, reliant on technology over spirit. A captured U.S. Navy manual on fighter tactics emphasized section integrity and mutual support, which Japanese commanders interpreted as a lack of individual aggression. They believed their Bushido spirit, combined with the Zero's technical brilliance, would guarantee continued dominance. They could not have been more mistaken, and the proof was already being assembled, bolt by terrifying bolt, in a Grumman Iron Works plant on Long Island. The American response was not born in a single brilliant flash of inspiration, but in a cold, calculated assessment of failure. The men tasked with creating the tools to win the war were not traditional military thinkers. They were industrialists, production engineers, and often immigrants who had fled the very regimes they now sought to destroy. At Republic Aviation, the chief designer was Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian-born aeronautical engineer whose accent still carried the echoes of Tbilisi. In 1940, Kartveli had been ordered to design a high-altitude interceptor. What emerged from his drafting table was unlike anything that had ever flown. It was huge. Where the Bf-109 had a wingspan of 9.9 meters and weighed 25 kg empty, Kartveli's design, designated the XP-47 billion, had a wingspan of 12.4 meters and would weigh over 45 kg empty. To German or Japanese eyes, it would look like a monstrous aberration. It was all built around a single, revolutionary component: the Pratt & Whitney RMS-2000 800 double WASP engine, an 18-cylinder radial behemoth that produced 2,000 horsepower, nearly double the output of the Bf-109's inline engine. But the real secret, the piece of technology that would make the P-47 Thunderbolt not just a powerful plane but a system killer, was hidden behind the pilot's seat. Kartveli and his team, working with General Electric engineers, integrated a massive turbo supercharger. This complex system took exhaust gases from the engine, used them to spin a turbine that compressed thin, high-altitude air, and then fed that dense air back into the engine's carburetor. The effect was revolutionary. While a Bf-109's performance fell off dramatically above 6,000 meters, the Thunderbolt's engine actually performed better the higher it flew. It could maintain full military power at altitudes where German and Japanese fighters gasped and stumbled. This was not a minor improvement. It was a fundamental rewriting of the rules of aerial engagement. Yet in its early testing, the XP-47 billion was a problem child. It was so heavy it needed enormous, wide-set landing gear that retracted into the wings. Its first flight was almost its last when a coolant line failed and the engine nearly caught fire. Skeptics within the USAAF called it the Jug, short for juggernaut, but with a clear connotation of clumsy bulk. One general reportedly said, "You can't make a racehorse out of a draft mule." Cartville and his team worked 20-hour days, ironing out the flaws, driven by a singular vision: to create a fighter that could not only survive in the lethal high-altitude environment over Europe, but dominate it. While Cartville wrestled with the Thunderbolt, another team at Grumman was performing a different kind of miracle. The F-4F Wildcat was holding the line against the Zero, but just barely. It was slower, less maneuverable, and outranged. The pilots flying them were dying at an alarming rate. The Grumman design team, led by engineers like Bill Schwendler, knew they couldn't out-zero the Zero. The Japanese fighter's incredible agility came from its lightweight construction. It had no armor plating for the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks. To try and match it would mean building an equally fragile aircraft, which went against every American instinct. Instead, Grumman took a different path. They started with a bigger, more powerful engine, the same Pratt & Whitney RA-2800 that powered the P-47. They designed a stout, rugged airframe that could absorb tremendous punishment. They wrapped the cockpit in armor plate, installed a bullet-resistant windshield, and fitted self-sealing tanks that could plug holes automatically. They gave it 650 caliber Browning machine guns, each firing a heavy, high-velocity round that could shred aluminum and flesh with equal ease. The result, the F-6F Hellcat, was on paper inferior to the Zero in almost every measure of agility. It was heavier, had a slower rate of roll, and a wider turning circle. To a Japanese pilot reading a technical summary, it would look like another clumsy American brute. What the summary couldn't capture was the Hellcat's devastating dive speed, its incredible structural strength that allowed pilots to perform maneuvers that would tear a Zero apart, and the life-saving protection of its armor. Grumman wasn't building a dogfighter. It was building a pilot-preserving, Zero-killing system, and they were building them at a pace that would soon become a tidal wave. The first prototype flew in June 1942, just days after Marseille's patrol over the desert. The lessons learned from the bloody early carrier battles were already being translated into metal. The first, faint tremors of this coming earthquake began to register in the most remote theaters, where the new American machines made their combat debuts. These initial encounters were so anomalous, so contrary to all established understanding, that they were systematically dismissed by Axis intelligence. In the Southwest Pacific, in the spring of 1943, veteran Japanese pilots flying Zeros from Rabaul began encountering a new, unknown American fighter over New Guinea. It was big, fast in a dive, and astonishingly tough. Pilots would return with stories of pouring cannon shells into it, only to watch it fly away. One after-action report from a respected warrant officer described an engagement where he had gotten on the tail of one of the new fighters. "I fired a long burst from 200 meters. I observed many hits on the fuselage and wing root. The aircraft did not burn or lose control. It then entered a steep dive and I could not follow." The report was filed at Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters. An intelligence officer, comparing it to known specs of the P-40 and the Bell P-39 Airacobra, penciled a note in the margin: "Pilot likely overestimating. No Allied aircraft can sustain such damage. Probable confusion with P-38 Lightning." The truth, that this was the P-47 Thunderbolt making its Pacific debut, was missed. Over Europe, the whispers started in the summer of 1943. The USAAF's 8th Air Force had begun its daylight bombing campaign, and the Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf, FW-190 pilots of the Luftwaffe's defense wings, the Jagdgeschwader, initially welcomed the sight of the American bomber escorts. The early P-47Cs had limited range, turning back at the German border. The German fighters could wait, then pounce on the unescorted bombers. But then the P-47 started appearing deeper over occupied Europe. They were fitted with clumsy-looking external fuel tanks that they jettisoned before combat. The first encounters were puzzling. A veteran Staffelkapitän of JG-26, Hauptmann Johannes Mackie Steinhoff, reported after a fierce engagement near Antwerp. The new American fighters are not like the Spitfires. They do not try to turn with us. They use their speed in the vertical. They dive away and we cannot catch them. And their firepower, it is like being hit by a freight train. Steinhoff was a serious, respected officer, not given to exaggeration. His report was noted, but filed alongside others that still spoke of easy victories against the fat ones. The prevailing opinion among senior Luftwaffe commanders was that these were isolated incidents, the result of encountering the rare competent American pilot or a specially modified aircraft. The idea that every P-47 rolling off the Republic line possessed these capabilities was considered absurd. German production of the superb FW-190 was just hitting 250 per month across all variants. The notion that America could be producing a fighter of comparable, or superior, performance at triple or quadruple that rate was literally unthinkable. It violated their entire understanding of industrial logistics. The voices of warning grew louder, but were muffled by bureaucracy and disbelief. In Japan, Commander Minoru Genda, the brilliant architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and a keen student of air warfare, began to see a disturbing pattern in the loss reports from the Solomons in late 1943. The kill ratio, once overwhelmingly in Japan's favor, was steadily, inexorably declining. Experienced pilots, irreplaceable veterans with hundreds of combat hours, were being lost at an alarming rate. The reports consistently mentioned a new Grumman fighter, the Hellcat. Genda requested a full technical assessment. The report he received was dismissive. Based on limited observations, Japanese naval intelligence concluded the F-6F had a top speed of approximately 580 km/h, was inferior in climb and maneuverability to the Zero, and was simply a slightly improved Wildcat. Genda was skeptical. The numbers didn't add up. If the Hellcat was so mediocre, why were his best pilots dying? He penned a confidential memo to the Naval General Staff, urging an acceleration of next-generation fighter projects and a re-evaluation of American industrial capacity. The memo was acknowledged, then buried under more pressing concerns about fleet losses and the deteriorating strategic situation. The institutional bias was too strong. The Zero had won the war's first battles. Therefore, it remained the ultimate standard. To suggest otherwise was to question the very foundation of Japanese naval aviation doctrine. In Germany, the disconnect became a chasm. The Luftwaffe's own testing unit, Erprobungsstelle Richlin, managed to get its hands on a relatively intact P-47D that had crash-landed in France. Their engineers tore it apart. What they found was a shock. The craftsmanship was not the crude, mass-produced work they expected. It was robust, simple, and incredibly well-made. The wiring harness was orderly and protected. The plumbing was secure. The 850 caliber machine guns were fed by a reliable, jam-resistant system. And the turbo-supercharger system, though complex, was beautifully engineered. The Richlin report, marked Geheim Kommandantschaft top secret, contained a chilling conclusion. The P-47D Thunderbolt represents a significant advance in Allied fighter technology. Its performance above 7,000 meters exceeds that of the Bf-109G and FW-190A in level speed and dive acceleration. Its structural strength is exceptional, Its primary weaknesses are its radius of turn and its rate of climb at medium altitudes. This was a devastatingly accurate assessment, but when the report reached the office of Generalfeldmarschall Erhard Milch, the man in charge of aircraft production, its impact was blunted. Milch was fighting his own war, trying to rationalize Germany's fragmented aircraft industry and get the revolutionary Me-262 jet fighter into production. He saw the P-47 report as a technical curiosity, not an existential threat. He scribbled a note to his staff. The Americans have built a high-altitude specialist. Our strategy is to attack the bombers at lower altitudes where our fighters are superior. The Zersterer destroyer units will handle these heavy fighters. The critical nuance, that the P-47's weakness at medium altitude was relative, and that it could still outdive and outgun anything the Luftwaffe had, was lost. The report was filed away. The men who would have to fight the thunderbolt in the sky never saw it. Meanwhile, in America, the machine was hitting its stride. The Jug was no longer a problematic prototype. It was a weapon of war being produced with terrifying efficiency. At the Republic plant in Farmingdale, and at a new, massive facility in Evansville, Indiana, the production lines hummed. The process was broken down into simple, repetitive tasks. Women, Rosie the riveters, and men too old for the draft worked around the clock. A completed P-47 rolled off the line not every week or every day, but every hour. By early 1944, Republic was producing over 400 Thunderbolts per month. Grumman's Hellcat production was even more staggering, approaching 500 per month. These weren't just numbers on a page. They represented a tidal wave of metal and firepower. For every Bf 109 or 0 that left a German or Japanese factory, 10 Hellcats or Thunderbolts were taking flight from American ones. And these weren't just copies, they were iterative improvements. The P-47D received a new bubble canopy that gave the pilot unparalleled visibility. Its engine power was boosted. It could carry bombs, rockets, and extra fuel tanks, transforming it from a pure fighter into a lethal fighter bomber. The Hellcat was refined with better engines and armament. This was the other American secret, not just mass production, but mass production of a constantly improving design. An intelligence officer in Berlin analyzing a P-47D captured in January 1944 was studying a machine that was already being replaced on the American assembly lines by a better model. The warnings from the front lines became screams, but they were screams into a hurricane of official denial. On the Eastern Front, where the Luftwaffe was locked in a death struggle with the Soviet Air Force, veteran units were suddenly transferred west in late 1943 to face the growing American bomber threat. These pilots, masters of low altitude, close-in dogfighting against Yaks and LaGGS, received briefings about their new opponents. The intelligence officers working with outdated information told them the P-47 was heavy, unmaneuverable, and vulnerable in a turning fight. The advice was to get in close, force them to turn, and finish them. It was advice that would soon get them killed. One such pilot was Oberleutnant Erich Hartmann, the future highest-scoring ace in history, then a young star of JG-52 on the Eastern Front. Before his transfer west, he spoke with a friend who had already flown against the Americans. The friend's warning was stark. "Forget everything you know, Erich. These are not Russians. Do not try to turn with them. Do not follow them down. They are not like anything we have seen." Hartmann, confident from his 148 victories, nodded politely but privately dismissed the caution as the nerves of a pilot who had flown one too many missions. He could not imagine a fighter his nimble Bf 109G could not outfly. The stage was now set for the collision. It would not happen in a single, cataclysmic battle, but in a relentless, daily grind of attrition that would expose the fatal flaw in the Axis worldview. The date was February 20, 1944. The USAAF dubbed it Big Week. a concerted effort to smash the German aircraft industry in a series of massive, coordinated daylight raids. For the Luftwaffe's fighter arm, it was to be their moment of truth, a chance to defend the homeland and bleed the Americans white. At airfields across France, Belgium, and Germany, pilots of JG-2, JG-26, JG-1, and others were roused before dawn. Among them was Lieutenant Heinz Nock, a 22-year-old pilot with JG-11 based at Jever in northwest Germany. Nock was no novice. He had 15 victories, was a keen tactician, and had even experimented with air-to-air bombing of bomber formations. He was intelligent, thoughtful, and a believer in the technical superiority of German engineering. As he walked to his FW-190-6 in the pre-dawn gloom, he felt the familiar mix of tension and confidence. Today, the radar plots showed the Americans were coming in force. Good, he thought. Let them come. We will teach them a lesson. Hundreds of miles to the west, over the North Sea, the lesson was already being loaded into the sky. It was not just a lesson in air combat, but in industrial logistics. The first wave consisted of over 400 B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 liberators from the 1st and 2nd bombardment divisions. But today was different. Today, they were not going to be left alone. Escorting them were not just the P-47s of the 4th and 56th fighter groups, but the newly arrived P-51 Mustangs of the 354th Fighter Group. The Mustang, with its revolutionary laminar flow wing and British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, was another product of the American industrial machine that German intelligence had utterly failed to anticipate. But on this day, the Thunderbolt would take center stage. The P-47s of the 56th Fighter Group, the Wolf Pack, led by the aggressive Colonel Hubert Hub Zemke, were carrying new, larger 108-gallon disposable fuel tanks. For the first time, they could escort the bombers all the way to the target and back. Nock's squadron scrambled and climbed, joining a growing stream of German fighters vectored towards the incoming armada. The morning was cold and clear, perfect for high-altitude combat. At 8,000 meters, Nock spotted them. The sky was dotted with the tiny, glinting specks of bombers, arranged in their formidable combat boxes. And around them, like swarms of gnats, were the fighters. He keyed his radio. "Achtung, Indianer," he called out, "many little friends." He estimated maybe 50 escorts, a significant number but manageable. His Gruppe had over 40 FW-190s. Other Gruppen were climbing all around them. The Germans had massed for a decisive blow. Then he looked closer. The escorts were not staying close to the bombers as they usually did. They were surging ahead, climbing to meet the German fighters head-on. This was aggressive, confident behavior he hadn't seen before. He focused on one group of fighters as they grew larger. They were big, with distinctive elliptical wings and a deep fuselage, Thunderbolts. He felt a flicker of the old confidence. He knew the drill. Getting close outturned them. He picked one that was slightly separated from its formation and rolled into an attacking pass. The FW-190 was a superb gun platform, with two 20mm cannons and two 13 machine guns. He closed to 400 meters, well within effective range. The P-47 seemed to fill his reflector sight. He fired a short, precise burst. What happened next defied all of Nock's experience. The Thunderbolt didn't break into a turn. It didn't even seem to notice the hits. Instead, it simply rolled over and dropped its nose. It vanished from his sight in an instant, turning into a tiny dot plummeting toward the earth with unbelievable acceleration. Nock stared, stunned. He had never seen anything dive that fast. It was as if it had been snatched away by gravity itself. He couldn't follow. No FW-190 could dive like that without risking its wings pulling off. Before he could process this, his wingman screamed over the radio, "Brake left! Brake left!" Nock yanked his stick, his aircraft shuddering as he threw it into a violent evasive maneuver. A stream of tracers, Not the familiar red or green of German guns, but a solid, angry river of orange, sizzled past his canopy. He caught a glimpse of another P-47, high above him, having just finished its firing pass. It hadn't come from the main group. It had been flying top cover, higher than he thought any escort could be. The altitude advantage he took for granted was gone. The radio net dissolved into chaos. He heard panicked voices overlapping. "He's on my tail, I can't shake him. The Dick Autos are diving from the sun. Verflucht, my engine. Where are they all coming from?" Noak managed to get a moment's breathing space and looked around. The sky, which minutes before had seemed under their control, was now a swirling, lethal maze. There weren't 50 escorts. There were hundreds. They were everywhere, above, below, in elements of 2 and 4, not clinging to the bombers but actively hunting the German fighters. He saw a FW-190 try to outturn a P-47 at medium altitude. The American pilot didn't take the bait. He simply climbed steeply, rolled over, and came back down in a slashing, high-speed pass, his 8 guns ripping the FW-190's wing off. It was a clinical, energy-based maneuver, devoid of the graceful, turning ballet Noak was trained for. This was brutal, physics-based slaughter. Then he saw something that made his blood run cold. A formation of P-47s, having driven off the initial German attack, didn't return to the bombers. Instead, they formed up and began a systematic sweep ahead of the bomber stream. They were clearing the path, proactively engaging German fighters before they could even form up for their attacks. This was not defensive escort. This was offensive air superiority, executed with a profligate expenditure of fuel and aircraft that the fuel-starved Luftwaffe could scarcely comprehend. Noak's fuel gauge was dipping into the yellow. He had been in combat for less than 15 minutes. He had fired a few rounds, evaded several attacks, and achieved nothing. Around him, the sky was dotted with the black smoke of dying aircraft, most of them German. A P-47 flashed past him, so close he could see the checkered nose art and the exhaust stains on its cowling. It was climbing again, seemingly without effort, its turbo-supercharger whining a distant, mechanical scream. It was heading for another group of 109s trying to climb to altitude. They were sitting ducks. In that moment, on the deck of his heaving FW-190, oxygen mask sucking at his face, ears ringing with the cacophony of battle, Heinz Noak understood. The briefings had been lies. The intelligence was a fantasy. This was not a battle against pilots of marginally inferior skill flying clumsy aircraft. This was a battle against a system that produced pilots by the thousands, trained them in a methodical, unglamorous way, and put them in machines that were not delicate instruments of aerial fencing, but armored, turbocharged sledgehammers. The qualitative edge was gone, obliterated not by a single brilliant design, but by the relentless, crushing weight of numbers, and a design philosophy that prioritized survival and firepower over elegance. He was not a knight in a duel, he was a man with a sword trying to stop a tank. He keyed his radio, his voice tight. "Alle Einheiten, disengage, return to base, save your fuel." The order felt like ash in his mouth. They were retreating, from the Americans, over their own homeland. But the lesson of February 20, 1944 was only the beginning. It was a tremor before the earthquake. For while Noak and his comrades licked their wounds, trying to understand how their world had been turned upside down, an even more profound shock was being prepared, one that would strike not at their fighters, but at the very foundation of their tactical doctrine. It would come from the sea, and it would target the most elite, most confident pilots the Axis possessed, the Japanese carrier aviators. And the instrument of their disillusionment would not be the rugged Hellcat or the thunderous P-47, but a weapon so technologically alien, so far beyond their conceptual understanding of naval warfare, that its very existence would be dismissed as science fiction. It was a weapon that saw in the dark, that could strike with unerring accuracy through cloud and storm, a weapon that made the vaunted skills of the Japanese torpedo bomber pilots suddenly, terrifyingly obsolete. And its first major test was scheduled for a place the Americans called the Philippine Sea. The Japanese High Command, still believing in the myth of their invincible carrier divisions and the divine wind of their pilot's spirit, was making plans for a decisive battle. They were gathering their finest carriers, their most experienced air groups, veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean raids. They called this Operation Agio. They believed it would be their Trafalgar, the battle that would break American naval power in the Pacific. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly grasp from their isolated island bases, was that steaming towards them was an American task force equipped with a technological advantage, so absolute it rendered their entire battle plan a suicide note. Aboard the American carriers, technicians were calibrating a new generation of air-to-air radar, fitting tiny, complex devices into the noses of Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers. These devices were not for navigation. They were for killing. In darkened rooms below decks, other sailors monitored glowing green screens that could see enemy aircraft formations over 100 miles away, in pitch darkness or through thick weather. The Americans were no longer just building better fighters. They were building a fully integrated, technology-driven combat system that removed chance and human limitation from the equation. The Japanese, preparing for a climactic clash of skill and courage, were sailing blindly into a fully automated killing zone. And as the sun rose over the vast emptiness of the Philippine Sea on June 19, 1944, the commander of the Japanese 1st Mobile Fleet, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, stood on the bridge of his flagship, the carrier Teiho. He looked out at his mighty armada, 9 carriers, including the new armored Teiho herself, veterans Shikaku and Zuikaku, and hundreds of aircraft on their decks. His pilots, the best of the best, were briefed and ready. They knew the American fleet was near. Ozawa's plan was elegant in its simplicity. Use the longer range of his aircraft to launch strikes from beyond the reach of American fighters, whittle down the enemy, and then close for the kill. He had every reason for confidence. His intelligence, flawed and outdated as it was, suggested the American carriers had fewer aircraft, and his pilots, though fewer in number than earlier in the war, were still qualitatively superior. The spirit of the kamikaze, the divine wind, was with them. He gave the order. Across the fleet, engines coughed to life. The first wave of Zero fighters, Judy dive bombers, and Jill torpedo bombers began to taxi, then roar down the flight decks and into the sky. They formed up into neat formations and turned east, towards the reported position of the American task force. The decisive battle had begun. Aboard the American flagship, the carrier USS Lexington, Admiral Mark Mitcher received the reports from his radar picket destroyers. The glowing screens showed them everything: the size of the Japanese formations, their altitude, their speed, their exact bearing. He turned to his chief of staff. "Well," he said quietly, "this is it. Tell the fighters to go get them." From the decks of Lexington, Enterprise, Yorktown, and 5 other fleet carriers, a swarm of F-6F Hellcats catapulted into the air. They didn't climb blindly to search. They were given vectors, altitudes, and numbers by controllers sitting in front of radar scopes. They were guided like bullets to their targets. The Hellcat pilots, many of them in combat for the first time, felt a strange calm. They weren't hunting. They were being led to a shooting gallery. The Japanese formation droned on, the pilots scanning the horizon for the first sign of the American fleet or its combat air patrol. Their leader, a veteran lieutenant commander with years of experience, saw nothing but empty ocean and scattered clouds. He was confident. They had achieved surprise. Then his wingman called out, a note of confusion in his voice. "Sir, above." At 10 o'clock high. The commander looked up. High above them, tiny specks were growing larger at an impossible rate. They were diving out of the sun with a speed that made his blood freeze. They weren't climbing to meet him. They were plummeting down from an altitude he hadn't thought enemy fighters could reach, and there were so many of them. Dozens, then more dozens, emerging from the clouds in perfectly timed waves. Before he could even give the order to jettison bombs and prepare to dogfight, the first Hellcats were among them. The .50 caliber bullets tore through the thin-skinned Japanese aircraft like paper. Bombers exploded in midair. Zeros, trying to turn and fight, found the Hellcats refusing to play that game. The Americans would make a single, high-speed pass, shoot one or two planes down, and then climb back up for another, never letting themselves get drawn into a slow, turning fight. The radio channels, which the Japanese believed were secure, erupted with American voices, cool and professional. Splash 1 Judy. Tally 2 zeros at 5 o'clock. Blue leader, we've got a group of Jills trying to sneak in low. It was coordinated, controlled chaos. The Japanese formation, meticulously planned and briefed, disintegrated in minutes. The lieutenant commander watched in horror as his strike group was annihilated around him. He never even saw the American fleet. He never got close. He managed to fire a burst at a Hellcat that flashed past, but his 20 shells seemed to have little effect on the sturdy Grumman. Then his own aircraft shuddered as bullets ripped into his wing, root, and cockpit. His instrument panel exploded. He felt a searing pain in his leg. As his Zero spiraled down towards the sea, his final, bewildered thought was not of tactics or skill, but of sheer, overwhelming numbers. They were everywhere. Back on the Tahoe, Admiral Ozawa waited for the first victory reports. Instead, a stunned radio operator handed him a fragmentary message, the last transmission from the strike leader. It was broken, filled with static and the sound of screaming engines. Under attack by hundreds of enemy fighters, impossible numbers, we are being annihilated. Then silence. Ozawa stared at the paper, uncomprehending. Hundreds. That couldn't be right. His entire first wave was only 69 aircraft. How could there be hundreds of fighters? It must be an exaggeration. Panic. He ordered the launch of the second wave, and then the third. Each met the same fate. The American radar-directed Hellcats intercepted them long before they reached the fleet, cutting them to pieces in what American pilots would later call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. By the end of the day, over 300 Japanese aircraft had been shot down, for the loss of only 29 American planes. It was not a battle. It was a systematic demolition of Japanese naval air power. But the true technological coup de grace was yet to come. As the shattered remnants of Ozawa's air groups limped back towards their carriers in the fading light, the American submarines, guided by intelligence decrypts, were already in position. And as the Japanese fleet turned to flee, the American carriers launched a final, audacious strike. It was late afternoon. The Japanese ships were at extreme range. Most of the American strike aircraft would have to fly to the limit of their fuel, attack, and then return in darkness, with many pilots having never made a night carrier landing. It was a huge risk, but Admiral Mitcher had a secret weapon. Among the Avengers in the strike wave were a handful of specially equipped planes. They didn't carry torpedoes. In their bomb bays were the new, top-secret devices, the radar-guided Bat glide bomb. It was a primitive but revolutionary weapon, a 1,000-pound bomb with wings and a small radar set in its nose. Once released, the bombardier would lock the radar onto a target ship, and the bomb would guide itself, gliding down with terrifying accuracy through the gathering dusk. The strike found the Japanese fleet just before sunset. The sky was a deep, bruised purple in the west, the first stars pricking through the high cirrus. The American pilots, their fuel gauges hovering near the red line, saw the Japanese fleet spread out below them like toys on a darkening pond. The carriers, identifiable by their distinctive white Hinamaru on the flight decks, were turning into the wind, recovering the pitiful few aircraft that had returned. Among the Avengers diving through the flak bursts were 3 aircraft from VT-51, their bomb bays open. In the belly of the lead Avenger, Lieutenant J.G. George Brown hunched over his scope, his world reduced to the glowing green phosphor of the radar screen. The crosshairs jittered over the blip representing a large ship. He tuned the gain, filtering out the sea return. The blip sharpened. It was the new carrier, the Tahoe. He toggled the release. Bat away. The weapon dropped clear, its small wings snapping open. For a second it seemed to hang in the air, then its nose dipped and it began its glide, a silent, unpowered shape falling through the twilight. On board the Tahoe, lookouts spotted the approaching aircraft, but the flak was concentrated on the higher-flying Avengers. The Bat, descending at a shallow angle, was almost invisible. Its internal radar emitter pinged, the returns painting the growing silhouette of the carrier. Small control surfaces on its tail made minute adjustments. It was no longer a bomb. It was a primitive, vengeful machine, single-minded in its purpose. On the bridge, Admiral Ozawa was receiving a catastrophic report. The submarine USS Albacore had put a single torpedo into Tahoe's starboard side an hour earlier. Damage was contained, but volatile aviation fuel vapors were seeping through the ventilation system. Ozawa was weighing the risk when a young lookout screamed, pointing to port. Something was coming in low and fast, skimming the wave tops. It had no engine glow, no propeller. It was just a dark shape, moving with unnatural, silent determination. Before the close-in anti-aircraft guns could traverse, it was upon them. The Bat struck the flight deck just aft of the island, penetrating into the hangar deck before its 1,000-pound warhead detonated. The explosion was muffled, deep within the ship's bowels. For a moment, there was a terrible silence. Then the aviation fumes that had been leaking through the ship found the ignition source. The secondary explosion was apocalyptic. A fireball erupted from the elevator wells, tearing the flight deck open like a tin can. The island's superstructure was engulfed in flame. Tahoe, the pride of the Japanese fleet, her armored deck meant to withstand conventional bombs, had been killed by a single, smart weapon. She began to list, internal explosions ripping her apart. Ozawa, wounded and stunned, was transferred to a destroyer. As he watched his flagship slip beneath the waves, taking down 1,650 officers and men, the technological truth was inescapable. The Americans could now kill without even seeing their target, in the dark, from beyond visual range. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was over. Japan had lost 3 carriers and, more importantly, over 90% of its embarked aircraft and pilots. The naval air arm, the weapon that had built the empire, was annihilated. Operation Agio was not a Trafalgar. It was a Tsushima in reverse, a decisive defeat from which there would be no recovery. The American system, radar, Hellcats, submarines, and now guided weapons, had functioned with brutal interconnected efficiency. The earthquake was now a continent-shattering event, and its tremors were felt in every theater, by every branch of the Axis military. The isolated incidents of 1943 had become the relentless, grinding reality of 1944. For the Luftwaffe, Big Week was merely the opening movement of a requiem. In the 6 weeks following that February day, the USAAF's 8th and 9th Air Forces lost 226 heavy bombers and 28 fighters over Europe. The Luftwaffe, trying to stop them, lost 342 fighters destroyed and another 116 damaged beyond repair. The kill ratio, once comfortably in German favor, had inverted to nearly 5 to 1 against them. The P-47s and P-51s were not just escorting. They were conducting free hunts deep into Germany, strafing airfields, trains, and anything that moved. The sky belonged to the Allies. On the Eastern Front, the transfer of veteran Jagdgeschwader to the West created a vacuum the depleted Luftwaffe could not fill. Soviet air armies, now equipped with vast numbers of robust Yak-3s and La-5FN fighters, achieved a numerical and qualitative superiority they had never before possessed. German infantry, accustomed to the Stuka's scream, now cowered under waves of Soviet Ilmenus II Sturmovix, flying with near impunity. The Eastern Front, which had consumed the bulk of the Luftwaffe's strength for 3 years, was suddenly bleeding it dry from the other direction. For the men in the cockpits, the statistics were a daily reality of death. Oberleutnant Erich Hartmann, the Black Devil of the Ukraine, arrived at JG-52's new base in Germany in the spring of 1944. His tally passed 200. His first mission against the Americans was a shock. Flying his Bf-109G against a formation of B-17s near Berlin, he executed his classic, low-risk attack from the rear, picking off a straggler. As he pulled up, a flight of P-51 Mustangs, which had been orbiting high above the bombers like hawks, fell upon him. He threw his 109 into a series of violent, turning evasions, the maneuver that had saved him 100 times against the Russians. The Mustangs didn't follow him into the turn. One simply pulled up, rolled, and came down in a high-side attack, its 650 caliber guns stitching a line of holes across his wings and fuselage. The impact was like being hit by a sledgehammer, his cockpit filled with smoke. For the first time in his combat career, Hartmann was not in control of the engagement. He was reacting, surviving. He dove for the deck, using his aircraft's smaller profile and the haze to escape. He landed with 30 bullet holes in his aircraft. The briefing had been wrong. The friend's warning had been right. This was a different war. He would adapt, surviving to become the top ace of all time, but his kill rate slowed dramatically. Every victory now was a hard-fought, dangerous exception, not the rule. The warnings from technical intelligence, once filed away, now became desperate pleas. In a hangar at Richlin, a team of engineers led by Dr. Heinrich Hertel finally received authorization to conduct a full flight test on the captured P-47D. The test pilot, a veteran of the Channel Front, took the Thunderbolt up. His report was a masterpiece of terrified admiration. "The climb to 8,000 meters is slower than a 109G," he wrote. "But once there, the aircraft is transformed. The controls remain crisp and powerful. The roll rate is good. The dive acceleration is frightening. I indicated 850 km/h in a steep dive and the airframe showed no sign of stress. Recovery is positive. In level flight at this altitude, nothing in our inventory can catch it. The cockpit is spacious. The visibility with the bubble canopy is superb. The 8 machine guns, fired in a ground test, tore a target sled to pieces in 1 second. This is not a clumsy aircraft. It is a purpose-built high-altitude energy fighter. To engage it on its terms is suicide." This report circulated among a small group of senior engineers and tacticians. They proposed emergency measures: upgunning the FW-190 with 30 cannons to kill bombers quickly before the escorts arrived, developing rocket-boosted interceptors for a zoom climb attack profile, accelerating the Me-262 jet program. But each solution ran into the same immovable wall: production. Germany was being bombed around the clock. The synthetic fuel plants were in ruins. Aluminum was scarce. Skilled workers were at the front. In March 1944, German fighter production peaked at 1581 aircraft for the entire month, a heroic effort under the circumstances. That same month, the United States produced 3091 fighters of all types and 7018 total military aircraft. The Ford plant at Willow Run, building B-24 Liberators, produced 1 complete bomber every hour. The German industrial machine, fragmented, bombed, and resource-starved, was being outproduced by a single American corporation. This disparity became physically visible to the men of the Axis. Lieutenant Heinz Nock, recovering from wounds received in April 1944, was being transported by train to a convalescent home. The train halted on a siding near Hamm, waiting for an air raid alert to clear. As he looked out the window, he saw a vast, seemingly endless column of American fighter bombers, P-47s and P-51s, returning from a mission. They flew in loose, confident formations, not in the tight defensive packs of the early war. For 22 minutes the stream of aircraft passed overhead. Noak, with a pilot's eye, counted. He gave up after 300. He later wrote in his diary, "It was a river of aircraft, flowing west to their bases. I thought of our own sorties, maybe 30 or 40 aircraft at most, and the desperate, costly battles we fought against just a fraction of this stream. We are not fighting an air force. We are trying to hold back the sky with our hands." In the Pacific, the collapse was even more total and culturally devastating. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot shattered not just planes, but the myth of Japanese spiritual superiority. Commander Minoru Genda, reviewing the after-action reports, finally received credible data on the Hellcat. A captured pilot from USS Lexington, interrogated, revealed the F-6F's true top speed was over 610 km/h, not 580. He described the armor, the self-sealing tanks, the training that emphasized teamwork over individual glory. Genda's worst fears were confirmed. He drafted another, more urgent memo. The technological and numerical gap is no longer a matter of degree. It is a difference in kind. The zero is obsolete. Our pilots are dying not because of a lack of spirit, but because they are flying coffins against armored, system-supported adversaries. This time, the memo was read, but the response was not technological or tactical innovation. It was a doubling down on the very spiritualism that had failed. The result was the formal creation of the Kamikaze Special Attack Corps in October 1944. It was the ultimate admission of defeat, a surrender of tactical thought, and a retreat into sacrificial symbolism. The machine had broken the man, and the man's only answer was to become a guided missile himself. The final, crushing demonstration of the American system's power came not in the air, but on the ground, during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. The German Ardennes offensive, launched in bad weather to neutralize Allied air power, initially succeeded. But on December 23, the skies cleared. What rose to meet the German panzers was not just fighter-bombers, but an entire integrated air-ground system. P-47 Thunderbolts, now operating as Jabo's Jagdbomber, swarmed over the battlefield. They were directed by forward air controllers in tanks and on the ground via radio. They carried not just guns, but 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, HVARs, and 1,000-pound bombs. A single P-47 could destroy a tank with a rocket salvo. They hunted in packs, methodically severing the German supply lines. The fuel-starved panzers, trapped on congested roads, were slaughtered. The Wehrmacht's last strategic offensive in the West was broken as much by the Thunderbolt as by infantry. A captured German corps commander, when asked what had stopped his advance, replied simply, "Jabo terror." By early 1945, the paradigm shift was complete and catastrophic for the Axis. In Europe, the Luftwaffe was a phantom. Its pilots, some with just 20 hours of flight training, were being thrown into the air in hastily assembled aircraft like the Heinkel He-162 Volksjäger, a cheap, dangerous jet meant to be flown by Hitler Youth. They were shot down in droves by the now veteran American pilots flying their superior, reliable machines. The average life expectancy of a new Luftwaffe pilot in 1945 was measured in sorties, not months. On April 7, 1945, the Luftwaffe launched its last major operation, Operation Werewolf, sending 183 mostly inexperienced pilots in Me-262 jets to attack Allied bomber formations. They shot down 12 bombers. They lost 25 jets, many to Allied piston-engine fighters like the P-51, which would pounce on them during their vulnerable landing approaches. The technological marvel of the jet could not compensate for the collapse of the system around it, the lack of fuel, the poor training, the overwhelming numerical superiority. In the Pacific, the Hellcat dominance was absolute. By war's end, the F-6F had achieved a claimed kill ratio of 19:1 against Japanese aircraft. American carrier task forces operated with impunity, bombing the Japanese home islands. The ultimate symbol of the new warfare was the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, a technological marvel that flew higher than any Japanese interceptor could reach, carrying bomb loads that could incinerate entire cities. The Zero, the symbol of Japanese imperial ambition, was reduced to a suicide plank, its pilot a component in a weapon system far less sophisticated than the Bat glide bomb that had killed the Tahoe. The human cost of this industrial and technological mismatch was etched in the loss lists. Of the 47 pilots who had served in Heinz-Noakes Staffel at the beginning of 1944, only 6 were still alive and not in captivity when the war ended in May 1945. Hans Joachim Marseille, the star of Afrika, whose confident hunt opened this story, never saw a thunderbolt or a Hellcat. He died in a freak accident over the desert in September 1942, his paradigm of individual aerial artistry still intact. He was spared the disillusionment that consumed his comrades. Erich Hartmann survived the war with 352 victories, the highest in history, but spent 10 years in Soviet captivity. His aircraft, the nimble Bf-109, was ultimately a relic. Johann Steinhoff, who had given the early warning about the P-47, became a senior commander in the post-war West German Luftwaffe, helping build an air force based on integration within a technological alliance, forever exercising the ghost of the lone ace. When the guns fell silent, the numbers told the final, devastating story. The United States had produced 15,683 P-47 Thunderbolts and 12,275 F-6F Hellcats. Germany, in its entire war, produced approximately 34,000 Bf-109s of all variants, its most numerous fighter. But the comparison was meaningless without context. By D-Day in June 1944, there were more P-47s and P-51s operational in England alone than there were serviceable Bf-109s and FW-190s in the entire Luftwaffe. The Japanese produced just 10,939 Zeros. The Hellcat alone outproduced Japan's most famous fighter. Loss ratios crystallized the truth. Over Europe, the USAAF's 8th Air Force lost 47 54 fighters in combat. They claimed 5280 German aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat, a ratio of 1.1:1. But when bombers' claims are added, the total German aircraft losses attributed to the 8th Air Force exceeded 18,000. In the Pacific, the Hellcat's 19:1 ratio was an exaggeration, but the true figure was still an unimaginable 13:1. The systems, the rugged, mass-produced aircraft, the radar-directed interception, the pilot-preserving design, had worked with murderous efficiency. The final perspective belongs not to a general or an ace, but to an engineer. In the autumn of 1945, a team of Japanese naval engineers under American supervision was touring the Grumman plant on Long Island. They saw the assembly lines, now quiet, where Hellcats had been built at a rate of 1 every 80 minutes. They were shown the blueprints, the subassembly jigs, the quality control processes. The lead Japanese engineer, a man who had worked on the Zero, asked through an interpreter how many engineering changes had been incorporated into the Hellcat design during its production run. The American guide consulted a log. Approximately 18 major and minor changes, he said. The Japanese engineer was silent for a long time. The Zero, perfected in 1940, had seen only incremental changes, mostly to its armament. Its basic design was sacrosanct. Finally, he spoke, his words a quiet epitaph for the Axis dream of qualitative superiority. "We were building aircraft," he said. "You were building parts. And you were building them faster than we could shoot them down." The war that Hans Joachim Marseille knew in 1942, a war of individual skill, of mechanical artistry, of clear-cut superiority, had vanished, a race not by a more brilliant art but by a colder, more relentless science. The desert sky that was his canvas had been covered over by the contrails of 1,000 assembly lines, the dogfight replaced by the production quota, the ace's intuition supplanted by the radar blip, and the computerized firing solution. The Falcon had been swatted from the sky not by a larger bird, but by a mechanized, automated swarm. The lesson, learned in the fiery skies over Schweinfurt and the Philippine Sea, was the defining lesson of the modern age. That courage and skill, in the face of industrialized, systemic power, are merely ingredients for tragedy. The star of Afrika had been shining in a galaxy that was already fading to black, its light outpaced by the dawn of a new, harder, and infinitely more scalable kind of warfare.